Before you start reading, drop a comment and let us know, what city are you watching from? We love hearing from all of you. And if this is your first time here at Crimson Secrets, we put out new stories every week, and trust us, Stas, you don't want to miss what's coming. Now settle in, because this one is going to stay. She signed the divorce papers on a Tuesday morning, slid them across the kitchen island without a word, and walked out the front door before he'd even finished his coffee. Not his mother, not their friends, not the partners at his firm who'd heard the rumors and filled in the rest themselves. They all expected tears. A scene. Some version of collapse from the woman who had, by every visible measure, given up everything to stand beside Callum Ashford for 7 years. What they got instead was silence and a closed door. And the quiet click of a latch that, in retrospect, sounded like the end of something much larger than a marriage. Callum Ashford was the kind of man who entered a room and rearranged it. Not through force, he was never loud about it, but through the slow, settled weight of a man who had never once in his life been told that he was wrong about something important. He was 41. He had built Ashford Capital from a one-room office in Charlotte into a firm managing nearly $2 billion in private equity. His name appeared in the right magazines. His suits were made in London. He played golf badly and didn't care because the point of golf had never been the golf. He had married Vera Lund 7 years ago in a ceremony at a vineyard in the Yadkin Valley, and he had told himself then and every year after that he had chosen well. But choosing well and paying attention are not the same thing. Callum had never learned the difference. Vera Lund had come into his life looking like someone who needed steadying. That was the honest truth of it, though she would have laughed at the description. She was 29 when they met, working as a hospital administrator in Charlotte, living in a 2-bedroom apartment she split with a co-worker, driving a car with a cracked dashboard and a passenger window that stuck on cold mornings. Her mother had passed 2 years earlier. Her father, a quiet man named Gerald, who had spent 30 years building irrigation systems for agricultural co-ops across the Midwest, had died when Vera was 17. She had been, for most of her adult life, entirely alone, in the way that people who are loved by many can still be entirely alone. Callum saw her at a fundraiser for a children's hospital and thought she was beautiful in a way that was almost understated, like she wasn't trying to be seen, and that made him want to look at her more. He asked someone who she was. He found a reason to be introduced. He was charming, because he always was, and she was gracious, because she always was. And 3 months later he had decided she was the one, and had made sure she knew it. What Callum did not know, what he never thought to ask, was that Vera Lund had not always been Vera Lund, struggling administrator, cracked dashboard, up. That version of her was real. It was also not the whole story. Gerald Lund had spent 30 years building irrigation systems. Yes, he had also quietly and without announcement developed the proprietary technology behind 3 of those systems and licensed the patents to agricultural firms in 8 countries. He had lived modestly because he wanted to. He had kept his estate in trust because he was methodical and careful, and he knew his daughter was young and grieving, and not ready. He had left instructions with an attorney in Des Moines. He had left a letter. He had left Vera when she finally agreed to open the envelope at age 31, something that looked less like an inheritance and more like a foundation. She had not told Callum, not at first, because she was still making sense of it herself, and then not later, because she had begun by then to understand something about the man she had married. He did not see her. He saw the shape of her. The way she moved through his world, organized his calendar, remembered the names of his clients' children, made the house feel like somewhere worth coming home to. He valued those things. He just did not think of them as things she was doing. He thought of them the way you think of good weather, as a condition of your environment, not a choice. Someone was making every day on your behalf. And then there was Meredith. Meredith Crane had been Callum's associate at the firm for 2 years. Before Vera noticed the shift. She was 34, sharp, in the way that made other people feel slightly slower. And she had a way of mentioning Callum that was half a beat too casual, the way people do when they've been practicing. Vera noticed because she noticed everything. She said nothing, because she was still deciding what she was looking at. By the time she was certain, she had already been preparing to leave for 8 months. She had not told a single person. Not her closest friend Dana, who would have been furious on her behalf and said so loudly. Not her cousin in Portland, not the attorney in Des Moines, though she'd had 3 quiet phone calls with him that year about restructuring the trust. She had filed the necessary paperwork to formalize the holding company her father had set up, moved what needed moving, and spent 11 months working with an intellectual property firm in Raleigh to assess and expand the patent portfolio. Gerald had left behind. She had done all of this from her home office, between 8 and 11 in the morning, while Callum was at the gym or already at the firm. She had done it without drama, without visible urgency, without letting any of it show on her face at dinner. That was the part that would come back to Callum later. In the long, sleepless middle of nights he hadn't anticipated. Not the leaving, the patience of it, the extraordinary, unhurried patience. He came home early on a Thursday in March. He wasn't supposed to. There was a dinner, a client, a thing. But the dinner had ended at 8, and he was tired, and he'd been tired lately in a way he couldn't quite place. He walked in through the garage, as he always did, and he heard her on the phone in the kitchen. He wasn't trying to listen. He stopped because he heard his name, and then he kept standing there because of what came after it. She wasn't saying anything dramatic. She wasn't crying, wasn't whispering, wasn't lowering her voice. She was speaking in the measured, even tone she used when she was working, and she was telling someone. He would learn later it was the IP attorney in Raleigh, that the licensing agreement with the firm in the Netherlands should proceed, and that she wanted the new terms to reflect the expanded scope of the secondary patent, and that the timeline for the agricultural division in Iowa was fine. But she wanted quarterly reports rather than semi-annual. He stood in the hallway for 4 minutes. He knew because he watched the clock on the microwave. When she hung up, she turned around and saw him, and she did not flinch. "You're back early," she said. "Who was that?" "My attorney." "I didn't know you had an attorney. You never asked," she said, and went back to the counter and began doing the thing she had been doing before the call, which was cutting an apple into careful, even slices. He should have asked more questions that night. He didn't. He poured himself a drink and told himself there was a reasonable explanation of it, and that he would get to the bottom of it when he wasn't so tired. This was the kind of thing Callum did, filed it away for later, when later kept not arriving. He was good at deferring the things that required him to reconsider something he had already decided. The reasonable explanation, had he looked for it, would have been unreasonable. The holding company that Vera had quietly formalized over the past year had, as of that March, controlling interest in a patent portfolio that generated just under $4 million a year in licensing revenue. Her father's original company, the one he'd structured and then essentially set aside not because it failed but because he'd wanted it to wait, had been appraised, at Vera's instruction, the previous autumn. The number that came back was not something Callum would have expected. It was not something he could have guessed because he had never thought to look. The call he was not supposed to find out about came 3 weeks later. He found out about it from a friend. The kind of incidental disclosure that happens at the wrong dinner, when someone assumes you already know something and mentions it in passing, and then watches your face and realizes immediately that you did not know, and that something has now broken that cannot be unbroken. The friend was a man named Perry, who worked in commercial real estate, and had been at a lunch where Meredith was also present. Perry mentioned lightly that it was funny running into her now that she and Callum were apparently so close. He laughed. He glanced at Callum's face. He stopped laughing. Callum drove home that evening without turning on the radio. He thought about 4 things on the drive in this order: whether Perry was wrong, whether Perry had misread something, whether Perry would tell anyone else, and whether Vera knew. He did not, until he was pulling into the driveway, think about Vera herself, about what she might have been carrying, about what it would mean if she did know that she had said nothing. She was in the living room reading when he came in. She looked up. She looked at his face. She closed the book with the careful, deliberate motion of someone who has been waiting for a specific moment and recognizes it when it arrives. "Sit down, Callum," she said. "Vera, sit down." He sat. She did not yell. She did not cry. She spoke to him for approximately 9 minutes, and what she said was precise and quiet, and so thoroughly organized that it became clear, somewhere in the middle of it, that she had rehearsed this, not because she was cold, but because she had known and had needed to be ready, and had made herself ready the way she made herself ready for everything, methodically, privately, without asking anyone for help. She had known for longer than he would have. She was not asking him to explain. She was telling him what she had decided. "I've had the papers drawn up," she said. "I'd like you to review them and respond within 30 days. I'm not asking for anything dramatic. I just want to be done." She left the room. She went upstairs. He sat on the couch for a long time, and the house, which had always felt like a condition of his environment, began to feel like something he had lost. He called her the next morning. She let it go to voicemail. He called again that afternoon. She texted back, "Please work through the attorneys." He did not want to work through the attorneys. He wanted to say something to her face, though he could not have said, if pressed, exactly what. An apology, maybe. An explanation, though he didn't have one worth giving. Something that would make her turn back toward him, the way she had always turned back toward him, steady and forgiving, and there. She did not turn back. The papers were filed on a Tuesday morning. She had the locks changed by Wednesday. He stayed at a hotel for 3 weeks and then moved into a furnished apartment in South Park that cost more than it should have, because he had not thought until that moment about what it cost to live your life without someone else managing the details. He ate badly. He slept worse. He went to the office and sat in meetings where people talked about capital and leverage and exit strategies. And he thought about the phone call he had overheard in the kitchen, and about the attorney in Raleigh, and about the apple being cut into careful, even slices. He asked Perry to find out more. He told himself it was just curiosity. What Perry found out, which was not much, because Vera had been careful, sent Callum to a business records search firm in early May. What that firm found sent him to a corporate attorney. What the corporate attorney told him on a Wednesday afternoon in a conference room that smelled of recycled air and expensive coffee was something Callum sat with for a long bit into a thought. Vera Lund, now filing professionally under Vera Lund Hargrove, her given middle name restored, was, as of the previous fiscal year, controlling interest holder in a company called Meridian Agricultural IP Holdings. The company held 14 active patents in irrigation and soil monitoring technology. The most recent licensing agreements, including the one with the Netherlands firm, were worth approximately $23 million over 5 years. The Iowa division her father had founded, which had been dormant for over a decade, was being reactivated. She had hired a COO. She had hired a general counsel. She had moved 3 weeks after the divorce was filed into an office in Research Triangle Park. Callum looked at the papers. He looked at the attorney. He said, "How long?" The attorney said, "The trust has existed since she was 17. The company's been dormant but legally active since her father died. From what we can tell, she started operationalizing it about 14 months ago. 14 months ago. He did the math without meaning to. 14 months ago, he had forgotten her birthday. He had come home from a business trip to find dinner on the table, a cake she had made herself, and a wife who looked at him like she had been waiting, and he had been on his phone through most of it. And when she finally said Callum, gently, just his name, he had told her he was dealing with something, and she had said, of course, and taken the cake to the kitchen, and not brought it back. He did not connect these things at the time. He was connecting them now, sitting in a conference room in Charlotte, holding papers that told him the woman he had dismissed without ever using that word had been, for their entire marriage, something he had never thought to wonder about. He wanted to call her. He wrote 3 different messages on 3 different evenings and deleted all of them because none of them said the thing he actually needed to say, and he wasn't sure he had the right to say it. He was not a man who apologized easily. Not because he was cruel, but because he had spent his whole life in rooms where uncertainty was weakness. An apology was admission, and admission cost you ground. You couldn't get back. He had learned this in boardrooms. He had applied it everywhere, including places where it had no business being applied. He called her once, from the parking garage outside his apartment, at 11 on a Friday night. She picked up on the fourth ring. "Callum, I know I shouldn't." "You shouldn't." "I know, I just..." He stopped. The parking garage was very quiet. A fluorescent light above him hummed and flickered. "I didn't know," he said, "about any of it, about your father, about what he left you, about what you were doing." There was a silence. Then she said, "I know you didn't." He stopped again. "That's not an excuse. I'm not using that as an excuse. I want you to know that if I had understood who you were, Callum." Her voice was not unkind. That was the part that got him right in the center of his chest. It was not unkind. "You didn't understand who I was because you didn't look. The money didn't change that. The patents didn't change that. If I'd told you about all of it on the first date, you still would have done what you did, because the problem was never what I had or didn't have. The problem was that you didn't think I was a person worth paying attention to." He didn't answer, not because he disagreed, because he couldn't. "I don't hate you," she said. "I want you to know that. I'm not walking away angry. I'm walking away done. There's a difference. I know there is. Take care of yourself," she said, and she meant it. And then she was gone, and the parking garage was very quiet, and the light above him kept flickering. She did not read the articles when they came out. There were two, one in a regional business journal, one picked up, briefly, by a national outlet, about the relaunch of Meridian Agricultural IP Holdings under new operational leadership, and the role Vera Hargrove was playing in revitalizing a set of technologies her father had developed and largely left behind. The pieces were not particularly dramatic. They were written in the dry, admiring tone of business journalism, and they focused on the patents, the licensing, the hiring, the Iowa operations coming back online. What they did not mention, because journalists rarely mentioned this sort of thing, unless they thought it made a better story, was that the funded through the company's operational budget was not a operational budget, was not a headquarters building or a product launch. It was a workforce retraining program for agricultural workers in 3 counties in Iowa whose jobs had been displaced by the automation of practices that her father's original technology had, in part, made possible. She thought about that a lot, about how a thing her father had built in good faith had rippled outward in ways he hadn't fully anticipated, and about what it meant to be responsible for that. Not guilty, exactly, but accountable in the way that people who inherit something are accountable for what they do with it next. She hired 32 people in the first 6 months. She knew most of their names by March. Callum saw her once, 8 months after the divorce was finalized, at a charity event in uptown Charlotte. The same kind of fundraiser where they had met, which struck him as the universe being either very deliberate or very indifferent, and he wasn't sure which was worse. She was with a group of people he didn't recognize. She was wearing something he hadn't seen before, dark green, and she looked exactly like herself, which was to say she looked like someone who had no idea she was being watched, and also wouldn't have cared. He didn't approach her. He stood at the edge of the room with his drink and watched her laugh at something someone said, and he thought about the parking garage and the flickering light, and what she had told him. "You didn't think I was a person worth paying attention to." He had been turning that sentence over for 8 months, in the way you turn something over when it is too sharp to put down and too heavy to carry. He left before the program started. He told himself it was because he had an early morning. He drove home and sat in the apartment that had slowly stopped feeling temporary and started feeling like the only honest thing in his life, and he thought about what it means to build something. Not a company, not a portfolio. Something real. Something that doesn't disappear the moment you stop managing the optics of it. He didn't have an answer. He was only beginning, at 41, to understand that he had been asking the wrong questions. Vera moved to Raleigh in the spring. She found a house with a good kitchen and a room that faced east, and she set up a small desk there, and she worked in the mornings in a way that felt, for the first time in a long time, like it was entirely hers. She thought about her father sometimes, about the way he'd moved through the world, quietly, without announcement, building things that worked, and then letting them go at a pace that made sense to him. She thought she understood him better now than she had when he was alive, which was maybe the most you could hope for with anyone you loved. She had dinner with Dana one Friday night, and Dana asked if she was seeing anyone, and Vera laughed and said not yet, and Dana said but eventually, and Vera said she thought so. Yes, eventually. There was no rush. She had learned that, too, that the things worth having generally did not require you to sprint toward them. That patience was not the same as waiting. That walking away from something broken was not the same as giving up on something good. She drove home that night with the windows down, and the radio on, and the flat, low expanse of the Carolina Piedmont stretching out on either side of the road, and she felt something she hadn't felt in long enough that she almost didn't recognize it. Unhurried, unafraid, entirely, quietly her own.